So I seem to have gone down a kind of different track with this. So I'm hoping that everyone can ask me questions of why I decided to go down this route. I wanted to look at the perceptions of Gen Z in relation more to protest as dissent, because over the last, I would say, like 10 years maybe, it's not that Gen Z or Gen Z are having no protests, but maybe it's that we're seeing them as having the wrong kind of protests. However, I want to kind of make the argument that the protests of Gen Z run along the same themes and demands as many of the protests that came previously from previous generations. However, I want to argue that the socio-economic conditions that have shaped these demands and what Gen Z are fighting for has changed. And so I am going to explain this in both the sense of the changing nature of the economy, hence why Generation Z want more security from their protests, and how the change in the political space in the last 10, 15 years have changed how Generation Z see their capacity to fight for agency in political change. So I wanted to just have a quick look at the protests of 1968, as I think this is one of the big changing points in political agency, as it was the first kind of globalized political change with like what was known at the time, or theorized slightly later, as the diffusion effect, where the protests were going beyond the individual governments and going kind of across the globe. And I wanted to highlight these protests in 1968 because there was varying demands. Across America, there was the civil rights movement and the student protests for changing the curriculum. In the UK and France, there were protests against universities and university expansion. In Eastern Europe, there were protests against censorship and changing academic practices. There were protests against nuclear weapons and protests against the Vietnam War. And why I bring this up is because the themes identified for the political change in these protests were war, environmental change, and racial relations, and of course changes in university space. This, I argue, is the same as many of the protests that have come in recent years. And so, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests, the walkouts for the climate against the environment, and the Israel-Palestine protests. However, what we're seeing here is that these protests are not necessarily seen in the same light. They're not seen as kind of liberating as they may have been before. And I don't disagree that there are differences here, I want to argue that the differences are that because Gen Z have a different idea of where power lies and accountability. Because I think the protests in 1968 were very much directed against the government and they saw it as a way to create, they were quite hopeful of political change. However, Gen Z are not seen as doing this. Their protests are often belittled and kind of pushed down and not actually being able to increase political liberation for their generation, but actually decreasing it. The protests are often said to be moving online and focusing much more on individuals than the government. This was labelled as like the boycott generation, in the fact that they're actually losing the capability to kind of do something as a big collective action and instead focusing on their own individual behaviour. And while I do agree that this can be seen as maybe cowardice or not quite as brave, I actually can see why they have tried to make this change. The boycott generation have realised that the power no longer lies so clearly with the government, but instead of the companies and the different institutions which it has been diffused. This is similar with the recent protests about Israel-Palestine in universities. What I noticed was it wasn't actually so much directed at trying to change foreign policy from the government as the protests were in 1968, but instead it was blaming the university for their institutional role in funding the war. And so this, I think, is not the fault of Generation Z, but the fault of the governments that came before them. They depoliticised many issues and they have relinquished accountability to different institutions, which makes it much harder to make political change on this single government level. The neoliberal reforms have changed the scope and the opportunity for political agency with Generation Z. And therefore, I think it's not a surprise that the protests and the dissent of Gen Z are changing. I do think there is a distinct point that there are changing narratives within the protests, that we're no longer as hopeful as previous generations, but plagued by a much more pessimistic outlook. We are driven not by hope and for the future or things for getting better, but by guilt and fear, and we just simply want to prevent collapse. And I quickly want to just note on why I think this is the case. Gen Z have grown up, and it's been seen that this has kind of shaped the way they see politics and see their future in an age of economic uncertainty, increasing risk, environmental destruction, and narratives of disaster. This, alongside the online environment which provokes kind of the worst case scenario and evokes provocative performity in our generation, has kind of created this hyperbolic and kind of tentative issue about what to do and how to kind of get around it. I think that this kind of has heightened this kind of sporadic movement and kind of uncertainty and kind of a collective sense of political agency and a fundamental loss of trust and belief in the formal political protests. This was seen in America in 2014. Jean Twenge, which I know is not how you say it, said that only 21% of Americans had a great deal of confidence in the political institutions to make changes, and this is lowest since 1972. And in the UK this year, the IPOS said, basically their statistical analysis said only about 37 to 40% of Gen Z actually voted. And although this doesn't necessarily respond to dissent as such, I'm just trying to really make it clear that the reason that Gen Z's protest is changing is not because we have less of an opinion than previous generations, but actually how we dissent and how we enact political change is much less clear than it was before.
Okay, thank you very much.